Hello, my name is Mike. I work in the school as my regular time job, and in my spare time I also tutor history. But due to the coronavirus, my school was closed, and I don't particularly have much need to tutor history when there are no exams at the minute. And so I thought, in the spare time, why not create this YouTube channel? And the whole aim of this YouTube channel is to try and create educational based history videos, similar to kind of like what this one will be. So this is a reaction video to Oversimplified's Second World War video, part 1. And the whole idea of this, rather than just being a straight up reaction video, is that along the way, like with other YouTube videos that I hope to react to, is that I'm going to try and pause and fill in the gaps and build upon what the video may gloss over or what it might miss out. And that's not a criticism of the video itself, don't get me wrong, it's just merely my idea of how I can maybe bring an extra level of education to the video that it might not necessarily include, and that's okay. And so, as said, I'm starting off with Oversimplified Second World War video. I've heard good things from this channel. A lot of my friends have watched it. A lot of my friends are history buffs as well, and they've told me good things about this channel. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it. And so, without further ado, one last thing that I'd just like to say is please head over to their channel, give the like and support to them as they are the original content creators. I am only merely commenting on it. If you like this video and this reaction, then obviously I would very much appreciate a like and supporting this channel, but they're the ones who really deserve it. And so without further ado, let's get into it.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with... bold.
Oh no. Yeah, so that's something that I didn't know myself. I didn't know that Mussolini actually was a teacher. Yeah, and that's part of the wonderful thing about history in these videos, that there's always room to learn more about the past. Ironically, it never gets old. But yeah, so when people think of fascism, a lot of people wrongly think of Hitler, or as the first one, whereas Mussolini is kind of the pioneer of fascism, and it's weird to say pioneer when it's something that was so terrible, but nevertheless he was. And because the tenets of fascism is nationality above class, it's kind of almost the idea of the ideological struggle. A nation succeeds through the conquest or the conflict, through strength, and strength through unity. And so yeah, Mussolini kind of is the pioneer of the idea of fascism. Hitler, I assume, given that we started with Mussolini, it will go on to Hitler afterwards before we get into the Second World War, but we'll just have to see.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister. And the king said, you and what army? This army. Fair enough. Then he went about his...
I mean... It's a joke, but it is quite similar to what actually happened, is because as Mussolini was gaining strength, he done what is called the March on Rome, which is what that tried to depict there, where I think Mussolini marched on Rome with around 20 to 30,000 fascists, and they basically demanded an exchange of power. And at the same time, the Italian Prime Minister, whose name eludes me at the moment, I can only apologise for that, he declared a state of emergency, and he basically asked the king for permission to use the military to disperse and, if necessary, repress fascism across Italy. The king, however, feared that doing this might cause violence, which is ironic when you consider the Second World War. But to an extent, it probably might be true, because fascism was quite popular along the kind of Italian military. There was a lot of people within the Italian military, and particularly the hierarchy, that kind of agreed with what Mussolini was suggesting. And so the king refused, and that led to the exchange of power that you had. And the king's idea was that Mussolini coming in would also kind of nullify and drive out those kind of socialists and communists. However, of course, the idea of avoiding civil war and some minor violence with clashing between 20,000 fascists ironically led to the series of events that caused the Second World War, or was part of the Second World War. However, again, it is something that's important to suggest, is that it's very easy for us to judge from hindsight, and that's something that you need to remember when you're talking about any history, not just the Second World War, is that it's very easy for us to comment and pick out the mistakes made by those in the past when we know everything that happened. I'm sure the king thought that he was making the best decision at the time, and that's just something to remember going forward.
Establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany.
Yeah,
Germany had been on the
wonderful.
loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spike the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all of this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attended a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2.
Okay, so just glaze over that a little bit there. The part where he's talking about when he marched and got arrested, that's referring to the beer hall push, which again, similar to kind of like the March on Rome, was where Hitler with his own supporters had kind of attempted to seize a degree of power. However, in this case, as opposed to the March on Rome, the police kind of dispersed and Hitler got arrested. And it's when he was in prison, I believe, following the beer hall push, is when he wrote Mein Kampf. And another thing to talk about that it glazed over a little bit was, again, another reason why the kind of situation in Germany was so dire, because as I said, the Treaty of Versailles was a loaded treaty. It was unfair. It disproportionately punished Germany in comparison to the First World War, really. And so, again, you had the reparations that they had to pay. You had the restriction of the military, no air force, no submarines, I believe, or a restriction on naval-borne craft. But another thing that really also heightened tensions against both the Weimar Republic and its neighbours was the occupation of the Ruhr. And the whole idea of, or briefly what the occupation of the Ruhr was, that those reparations that Germany had to pay, Germany wanted to originally pay them in German marks. However, the Allies, basically the Entente, Britain, US, France, and the other nations that Germany had to pay reparations to, didn't value the mark as a currency. And so therefore, Germany had to pay those reparations in either foreign currency that had some value, like the franc or the pound or the dollar, or they had to pay them in raw materials. And so Big Brain Germany decided that they would simply print more German marks to buy foreign currency to pay off their reparations. Clearly they don't understand how hyperinflation works, because printing more money only devalues that money. And so as a result, Germany kept falling behind in their payments, both of raw materials and of those foreign currency. And now, at the time, Britain and the US understood that perhaps the reason why Germany was falling behind with their payments was because they probably couldn't actually afford to pay them. However, France, just like during the Treaty of Versailles, wanted Germany to be punished, and they was a lot less lenient. And so when Germany made successive failures to repay some of their reparations, French forces simply occupied the Ruhr region of Germany. And for those of you who don't know, the Ruhr region of Germany is kind of the heartland, or like it's a part where lots of German industry is located. And so France's idea was that, well, if you're not going to pay us, we're just going to occupy your industry, and as your workers produce the raw materials, we will just take them. And so the German government at the time thought, well, we're not having this, and so they ordered that the workers in the Ruhr Valley, or the Ruhr region, simply go on strike. And they would support that strike by paying them. And how would they pay them? You've probably guessed it. They printed more money, which just caused more hyperinflation, which meant the economy went down the pan even more. But it also had a dual purpose, because while those strikers, while the workers were striking, there was also clashes between French soldiers. Because remember, this is only relatively short time after the First World War, so in Germany there is still a lot of anti-French sentiment, and from the French soldiers themselves, many of which were veterans of the First World War, there was still a tremendous amount of anti-German sentiment. And so there was multiple clashes between French soldiers and German workers and strikers, and I think, I might be wrong, but I think over the term of the occupation there was a few hundred German deaths. Eventually France withdrew from the Ruhr region due to international pressure, following several accounts of German civilians being shot by French soldiers. However, it didn't really stop the ill feeling, because all it meant was that the German government had further tanked its own economy due to hyperinflation, and it had also looked weak because a foreign power had essentially invaded Germany, killed and shot its citizens in the street, and the German government was seen to not really act. And so it just drew more and more people towards the extremist ideologies of both left and right. And it's something like Hitler capitalised on with the NSDAP. And yeah, as we'll get through, eventually he grew to power through some clever, albeit devious, political masterminding, but that is how ultimately he got to power. Was the Second World War very much is sown from the seeds of the First World War.
Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years, until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so.
Yeah, again, that's kind of colonialism in a nutshell. It's kind of devious in the way that they deal with each other. It is shrewd, but especially from the European powers, to take the opportunity to do this. But obviously, if you're Japan, then you are going to feel hard done by.
Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I...
Yeah, that was the Russo-Japanese War, which I believe was 1905. And again, it kind of shattered this idea of European dominance, because, yeah, the Japanese soundedly beat the Russians. They sunk them fleet. Sunk two fleets. They sunk both the Russian kind of Pacific fleet, and that's a story in its own right. The Russian Baltic fleet sailed all the way round. They blew up a bunch of British fishermen ships, fisher trawlers, because they thought that they were Japanese invading through the Baltic Sea. And so Britain closed the Suez Canal off to them, which meant the Baltic fleet had to sail all the way around the Horn of Africa and then up. And then when they actually reached there, it took them months. And as soon as they got there, they got utterly destroyed in their first battle. their first conflict with the Japanese Navy, which is almost meme-worthy in its own right. But yeah.
They took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia, and then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And
pretty much. Yeah.
In 1938, Hitler's army marched into...
There's been a lot of criticism of Neville Chamberlain, and again, a bit like what I said earlier, Neville Chamberlain was doing what he probably thought was the correct decision at the time. Obviously, now that we have hindsight, we knew clearly that it wasn't, and there's a lot of kind of revisionist history now that tries to deflect the blame from Chamberlain. However, again, as we know of both Hitler's character and what panned out to be, the acts of appeasement only kind of made things worse, really.
Austria, and just took it with no resistance. Boom.
Yeah, so when the Germans marched into Austria, and the Austrian Bundeswehr was there, they were stationed, but the Austrian government, I believe, was told to stand down to not seek any conflict with the Germans. And so the Germans basically marched in and assumed control of Austria, and there was what they called an Anschluss, which was a vote. However, it was far from democratic. The vote was not secret. It was not anonymous. People was voting practically under the guise of the German army. You know, you had people going up to voting while there was a soldier overlooking them, and then rather than putting it in a ballot box, they would hand it to a German official. And I think they was talking about, you know, an insane amount in some regions. 95% of people all wanted to join with Germany. And so the vote was very clearly skewed, it was very clearly biased, and it was very clearly undemocratic. However, that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of support in Austria for the Nazi Party or for unification with Germany, because there was. When the German troops also crossed over the Austrian border and were marching into Austria, there was also a lot of cases where Austrian people were lining the streets, flying Nazi flags. And so it's an important thing to remember. It wasn't just poor, plucky Austria, but there's a mixed bag. History is grey. That's the reality of it.
This is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're going to give you what..." Hang on. This meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want. Really? Yeah. Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing with the Sudetenland as well is the Sudetenland was also the region of Czechoslovakia where most of the Czechs' border defences were. All of practically their land forts, their trench systems, their defence networks was in the Sudetenland. And a bit like what the video suggests, generally that is what happened, is Britain and France kind of mediated with Germany without involving Czechoslovakia at all. And as a result, the Sudetenland was handed over to Germany, which meant the Czechs lost all of their defence networks. And, as we're going to see, when Hitler just pushed on and took the rest of Czechoslovakia, the Czechs could put up no resistance because they didn't have any feasible time to reorganise or kind of redeploy any of that defensive network that was lost in a decision that they weren't even part of.
Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace, and we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What?
Yep.
He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia?
Yep.
Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance.
I believe it was also there previously that you had the Abyssinian Crisis as well. But yeah, attacking Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, who was the leader of Ethiopia at the time. I believe there's even reports that the Italians actually had to use gas on the Ethiopians, which, committing kind of war crimes and genocides against people before the Second World War had even really started. Yeah.
To the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people.
Yeah, something that a lot of people I think seem to forget is they seem to remember the Nazi war crimes, as they should, with the Holocaust and stuff. They are genuinely terrible, and they should be remembered as such. But a lot of people, I find, also forget about the war crimes committed by the Japanese during the Second World War, and Nanking particularly is terrible. Perhaps that's another video in the future, but there's some of the source material on that is terrifying, really. Japanese newspapers publishing kind of kill counts that soldiers or officers would basically compete to see how many people they could kill, and they would publish it in the newspapers. And there was mass rapes. You had the comfort women, as they was known, which essentially was taking Chinese women and children to use as comfort women, when in reality they was essentially raping them, forcibly abducting women to use as entertainment for the soldiers. Yeah, it's a period of history that's not nice to learn, not nice to know about, but it's still very important to remember that.
Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future. Sounds good.
Yeah, that's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions.
Yeah, the BEF.
wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your influence. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slight...
Yeah, because in that moment as well, a lot of people seem to forget that Norway and Denmark were actual fronts. Although they weren't long-lasting fronts, there was still, throughout the war, there was Norwegian and Danish resistance networks that fought continuously throughout the war, and they was assisted by the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And at the same time, when Norway fell, Norway was in possession, I believe, of the largest merchant fleet in the world. And so when Norway fell, all those merchant ships essentially made for Britain, which, particularly in the beginning of the war and throughout the entire war, genuinely, when you talk of the German U-boats, proved vital in their convoys and able to transport shipping and goods, which really can't be overstated. And again, just briefly mentioning there, Sweden exporting iron ore, Germany was fairly reliant on some other nations for particular resources. Oil, particularly, they traded with the Soviet Union a lot for, which the Soviet Union's generally suspected at undercutting the Germans to essentially make them that if the Germans ever went to war with the Soviet Union, that they'd be running at a deficit relatively soon, which is what ended up happening. But Sweden also made it very clear that while they were producing iron ore for the Germans, had Germany thought that it might invade Sweden, then Sweden made it very clear that there was demolitions rigged up to those mines, and should any invasion happen, those mines would happen to be buried in the ground from those explosives. So it's important to remember.
In the embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended, because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too. But they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to remember there is the French, on the Franco-German border, there was the Maginot Line, which was impenetrable. It was a really well kind of made defensive line. However, as said, the Ardennes, the forest, they thought that they would be impenetrable to tanks and mechanized units. However, again, as history has shown, that wasn't to be the case. And the same with the Belgians. The Belgians had a wonderful fort called Ibn Amel, which was built to kind of withstand any attack except from the air. And in the end, it was taken by German Fallschirmjägers, the paratroopers, who came in both from planes and parachuting and through gliders, and took it from kind of above. And that's why Germany was able to kind of punch through Belgium as well. And with Dunkirk particularly, yes, it was kind of the place where the RAF earned its wings, because the RAF at the time was still relatively inexperienced, and you had the little convoys coming along. But it's also an important thing to remember as well is that the French played a pivotal role in Dunkirk. It was their rear guard of about 100,000 or so. They ultimately made the evacuation possible, and the French also lost a lot of destroyers themselves in evacuating the beaches of Dunkirk. I think they lost actually more destroyers than the British ships in evacuating those men off the beaches. So their commitment to that needs to be remembered as well. And again, the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg also then went on to have a government in exile in the UK.
With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that.
Oh.
Somebody explain to me.
Remember guys, have your ads on, supports the content.
Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front. So he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its
Vichy
existence
France,
as a German
yep.
puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense.
Yeah, that wasn't true.
The UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships.
Yeah.
So
when the Royal Navy sailed down there, they wanted to take control of the French ships, or the Vichy French ships, or at least stop them from falling into German-controlled hands or Italian-controlled hands. And when this request was made to the ships at that port, it was refused, and so the Royal Navy just sunk them in harbour to make them unusable for the Axis.
Have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming.
Okay, I'm back. Apologies for that. My laptop battery ran out. For future reference, I suppose it would be a good idea to make sure my laptop's fully charged, but there we go. First time for it. So where was we? Oh yes, the Battle of Britain. And I forgot to mention it earlier, but with the invasion of Poland, but a special commendation needs to be made for the Polish military during the Second World War, because particularly during the invasion of Poland, many Polish pilots in particular, along with other military of course, but pilots particularly were able to get to neutral Romania, and then from neutral Romania they was able to get to France and Britain. Some Polish military fought actually in the Battle of France itself, but many of them actually made it to the UK and served alongside British forces, and in particular a large number of those Polish forces actually was pilots, and these pilots served with distinction alongside the RAF, particularly in the Battle of Britain. I think there was the largest contingent of foreign fighters in the Battle of Britain. You obviously had Britain as the highest, and then I think Polish were the second highest nationality of combatants. And of course you need to remember that it was also a huge amount of other nations that took part in the Battle of Britain. You had Canadians, South Africans, I think a couple Greeks, French obviously, and you even had Americans who, seeing the situation that in Europe, decided that they wasn't going to wait for their own country's intervention. They actually went and took up the fight themselves, and so that needs to be commended. But the Polish RAF particularly, the Polish fighters in the RAF need to be commended because they were exceptional pilots and exceptional soldiers, and albeit to the irritation of the conventional RAF, as they had a habit of being hyper aggressive, kind of breaking formation and such like that. But there was one particular Polish commander whose name eludes me, and it really annoys me, and so after this recording done I'm going to find his name and I'm going to put it in the description for people to go out and learn about him more. But he actually rose up so high that he ended up commanding a British RAF squadron himself. So you had a Polish foreign fighter commanding British RAF pilots with a squadron of his own, which is an amazing achievement. A lot of people might dismiss that, but that can't be overstated how much of an achievement that is. But yeah.
But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside, away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel.
Yeah, so that is the Blitz. as we know in Britain. I don't know if it has a different name elsewhere and abroad. If it does, then please inform me, because I'd love to know. And yeah, as I said, the Blitz, as most people know, particularly in Britain at least, is the bombing raids of the Luftwaffe on British cities. And so, as I said, children were sent off to the countryside where they'd be safer. People slept in the underground tunnels, the subway, as Americans call it. People had bomb shelters both inside their house, like under tables, as well as having Harris shelters, as we call them, like in their garden, which was like a domed kind of bomb shelter. And yeah, it was the concept of living almost on a front line. But having said that, morale was remarkably strong. There's kind of the whole kind of British stereotype of stiff upper lip, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was that stiff upper lip. You had there's these wonderful photographs, and I implore people to go out and have a look at them. There's the famous staged one of the milkman walking along the rubble with the milk bottles doing his normal milk delivery, and while that photo itself is staged, it kind of encapsulates the morale of the British civilians, and particularly London and those who lived in the cities at that time. You have a wonderful shop front that had a bomb detonate next to it, and this blew out half the building and shattered all the windows, and it has a sign outside of it saying we're still open, just a little bit more open than usual. So yeah, it didn't quite go to plan, but and again, I don't know if it will include this in the second part of the video because it's nearly over, but bombing raids against civilian targets were perpetrated by both sides, of course. It's just something that needs to remember. Bomber Harris and the USAF were no means innocent when it comes to targeting civilians, but then again, it's war, so kind of hard to play the morality game when there's a war going on.
This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Okay, well that's part 2 as this wonderful buffering continues. Yeah, so that's the end of part 1. That was really good. I enjoyed it. It was let's see one. Let's just skip that. There we go. Yeah, that was part 1. I really enjoyed that. It was informative, educational, and yeah, it's quite funny. You know, with him shooting himself in the foot. Yeah, I know. I really like that, and I'm really looking forward to doing part 2. And obviously, again, when I say about filling in the gaps that these videos kind of miss or overscape, the video itself is called Oversimplified. And even if I do this with videos that aren't oversimplified, it's not a criticism or a knock at the video itself. It's just merely how I think that I can kind of build upon it and try and help kind of bridge that educational message forward. Because at the end of the day, that's what these videos are. They're kind of teaching people about historical and past events in a light-hearted, fun, entertaining way, and that's a really good and important thing. So again, please go and support the original content creator here over Oversimplified. They've done a cracking job, so go over and support them. And if you only have one like a subscription, I don't know why there would be an arbitrary amount, but if you've only kind of got the patience to click on one link and subscribe or whatever, then do it over at those guys. Obviously, if you like what I do, then I'd very much appreciate the support. There's a like in the description. I'm thinking of setting up a Patreon as well, and so if I actually do that, then and then you guys can recommend videos that you would like to watch, and kind of like to watch, like me to react to and watch to, and kind of go on from there. And yeah, I have a lot of interesting things I'd like to do with this channel, like do some more reaction videos to other YouTubers, YouTube videos and stuff like that, as well as perhaps get films involved, both historical films like the PSAs, like the old film reels that the American government made for American GIs, because there's a lot of them available on the internet, and that could be quite fun to react to and watch to, and kind of comment along to see what types of things the American government was telling their soldiers at the time. And obviously, if there's an interest for it, then perhaps branch out into looking at how Hollywood handles historical events. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.